I believe they did, mate. I'll check for you. Right, okay, I now welcome representatives from Rex Airlines. So for the Hansard record, if you could please give your name and the capacity in which you appear today.
Good morning, Mr Chairman. My name is John Sharp. I'm the Deputy Chairman of Rex.
Would you like to make an opening statement, Mr Sharp, before we go to questions?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much indeed. Well, firstly, thank you very much for holding this inquiry into the future of aviation in Australia. I think it's a very important topic and one which is obviously critical to our interests. But when talking about the future, I think it's also useful to make some reference to where Rex has come from and how we get to be where we are today, and that helps guide us to the future. Rex started in the form of Hazelden Airlines in 1953, working out of Central West New South Wales, Max Hazelden with one aeroplane, an Oster. It was added 2 years later by the co-founder of Rex, Don Kendall, who started his business in Wagga in 1964, and those two businesses ran separately until they were acquired by Ansett, and when Ansett collapsed they were put up for sale and they were acquired by a consortium of people who merged the two businesses into one and formed what we now know as Rex Airlines. And apart from the first year of its operation, Rex has managed to operate profitably. We've arrived over the years at the pandemic, the COVID pandemic in March of last year, continuously profitable from that point and without any debt. During that period we managed to more than double the number of destinations we fly to, and we doubled the number of passengers that we carry throughout the course of the year. And it's been a success story in aviation. No one else can claim to have been profitable throughout all that period of time, and no one can claim that they arrived at the pandemic without any debt. So we're somewhat unusual in that sense compared to any other airlines in Australia, and indeed unusual globally, because there aren't many airlines that can claim that. As a result of it, we've become the largest independent regional airline in Australia, and you would have noticed that we have recently announced our move into the domestic airline market, which we commenced on Monday of this week. However, it's also worth pointing out that since COVID came about early last year, the effect that COVID has had on Rex and all regional airlines, has been quite dramatic. And we went from having on average around 5,500 passengers per day to having 120 passengers a day over the course of about 2 weeks. It just literally fell off a cliff. It was quite stunning. We've never had, in all the previous setbacks we've had, whether it be SARS or 9/11 or GFCs, we've never had such a dramatic impact on our passenger numbers and hence our revenue as we had in that period in the early part of last year. So an unprecedented negative impact, and I have to say today, Mr Chairman, that there wouldn't be a regional airline in Australia today if it had not been for the Commonwealth Government's assistance that they threw at the industry. Most regional airlines have a very small balance sheet. I describe the balance sheet basically being the family home. Rex is somewhat different in that we're a listed company. We do have a bigger balance sheet, but even we, I don't think, would have managed to have survived without a form of assistance that the Commonwealth put to us and the whole industry, the regional airline industry, early last year. So we're very grateful to the Commonwealth Government for the assistance they've provided. We very much appreciate it, and I make the point, it's a very strong point, that there simply would not have been a regional airline industry today without that assistance. And so it's been critical in maintaining what I think is an essential piece of infrastructure for regional Australia. So many communities we serve are very remote. Places like Broken Hill and Cooper Pedy, if you ever want to drive from Broken Hill to Sydney, it's about a 16-hour drive. So, it's not an option that many people would welcome, and the airline therefore becomes a very critical part of a community like Broken Hill, but there are lots of other communities like that regional airlines service around Australia. During the course of all of this pandemic, our passenger numbers have dropped on average by 71%. It varies from state to state. At the moment, our average passenger numbers compared to pre-COVID is about 40%. It hasn't climbed back. We were almost at 40% in July last year, and then with the various border closures and restrictions on travel, lockdowns and so forth, whilst we've gone up and down, we're pretty much back to where we were in July last year with about 40% of our pre-COVID passenger numbers. The government's assistance package has meant that we can operate a minimum 2 services per week to our regional destinations. We can add to that by triangulating our services through another town and make that 3 services a week, which are sponsored under the RRANS program of the Commonwealth Government's assistance package. So again, it's been extremely welcome. I mentioned that we made a decision to expand into a domestic airline business. We've done that by raising additional capital, separate to any other capital that we had. We have raised that via a private equity firm, have allocated $150 million to us in the form of a convertible note. And I want to stress that the expansion of the domestic market is wholly and solely funded via that investment in the convertible note by PAG into our business. And of course, that has enabled us to undertake this expansion into the domestic market. We've also, in recent times, undertaken some reorganisation of our more traditional regional airline routes. And we made an announcement about that a week or so ago. We're dropping out of some destinations, around 5 of them, and we'll be looking at additional regional destinations as a consequence of trying to take up opportunities that have existed as a result of the withdrawal of Virgin Airlines from some of those regional markets. And so that's part of what we're doing for the future. I note that from time to time people try and claim that we're funding our expansion out of the Commonwealth Government funding. I won't point to anyone in particular, but I'm sure that they would be reassured to know that that is not the case. We are not funding our expansion via the Commonwealth Government funding. It's simply a misnomer. I also note some of our competitive colleagues, some who have been here just a few moments ago, have tried to paint that picture as well. It's certainly not true at all. We have... Yes, well, thank you, Senator Searle. That's a number of people have believed that to be the case because some people have told them that's the case, but it's not the case. The Commonwealth's requirements, the terms and conditions of receiving the funding under RRANS require us to spend the money according to those terms and conditions. We are audited by the Commonwealth. We have to expose all of our financials to the department so that they can see where we spend our money, where we receive the money, and that is the way the RRANS program works, and we are required to comply with it. We are not allowed to spend the money on any other activity, and hence that's been the requirement of the Commonwealth under the RRANS program, and the money is spent according to those terms. So we comply with that, and we are audited on a regular basis to ensure that is the case. So it's one of the misnomers that has developed, and I'm pleased to be given the opportunity to clear it up here today before you. And I'd just like to come towards the end of my opening remarks, Mr. Chairman, by saying that Rex has over the years provided a reliable service, we believe at affordable prices, for regional Australia. We travel to some 60 destinations around the country. We employ about 1,150 people approximately. Normally during the course of a week we would do 1,200 regular public transport flights a week, something in the order of about 70,000 regular public transport flights in a year, which is actually not far off what Virgin would do. Virgin is around about 100,000 regular public transport flights per annum. So, whilst we are small in terms of size and number, we actually operate a lot of flights, relatively large by comparison with any of the other major operators. And so our entry to the domestic market, which is about the future, means that we can offer consumers more choice, better services, we would believe, and certainly more competitive pricing. And I think the evidence of that has been in the public arena now for some weeks, as we've been offering tickets at very low prices between Sydney and Melbourne. And earlier this week we announced an expansion of our network from Sydney to Melbourne to Sydney to Coolangatta, Melbourne to Coolangatta, and Melbourne to Adelaide, which will commence towards the end of this month. So, more competition in these markets is good. It's good for the consumer, and we intend to expand our network further and to operate more services around Australia as time goes by. We intend to build on our regional network and add more destinations to it, be it that we're removing some destinations because we can't sustain them unless RANZ is continued. If RANZ is continued, then we will be able to sustain those additional routes to places like Cooma, Bathurst, Lismore, Grafton. But if RANZ is not continued, we won't be able to afford to do that. So the numbers there have been surprisingly small over the last 10 months. So we see the future for aviation as one that has lots of challenges. We see it as one that has lots of opportunities. We think our business has a long track record of giving good service to people over a long period of time, and we look forward to the challenges ahead. I have got some initiatives which I hope you'll drag out of me in questioning about where we think regional aviation in particular has a future and how we might achieve that. But I'd like to conclude my remarks today, Senator Sterle, by just putting on record our gratitude not only to the Commonwealth but to our staff who've been with us throughout this journey. We've had to stand down a lot of people. We've not made anybody redundant. Thankfully, everybody who's been stood down gets stood back up every week to do some work, and we try and share the work between everybody so that everybody gets a turn at flying the plane or being a flight attendant or doing whatever work is necessary. We try and rotate people around so people remain current, people still believe they've got a job and that they're going to work once a week or once every couple of weeks, whatever it might be in their case. So we've enjoyed strong support and loyalty from our staff, and I'd like to place on record our gratitude for that.
Thank you, Mr Sharp. I'm sure the travelling public of Australia are licking their lips at the forthcoming price war between the major capitals as well. Senator McDonald, would you like to kick off? And then Senator Sheldon has a series of questions too.
Thank you very much, Chair. And good morning, Mr Sharp. I'm pleased that you are here to provide evidence today as one of the second tier. Is that how you describe yourselves as in the aviation sector?
Well, we're certainly not a major airline by any stretch of the imagination. We're a smaller regional airline that's expanding in the domestic market, but we're not the size of a Virgin or a Qantas by a long measure.
So, Senator Sterle just made that comment about Australians looking forward to the price war. I mean, that's a very real threat to you, isn't it? That there be that the majors act, I won't say together, but certainly act to push prices down until it becomes unviable for new competition to come into the space. It's certainly been my experience on regional routes in Queensland.
Yeah, I mean, a small airline like Rex runs a risk of being, if you like, swamped by competitive pressure from particularly Qantas, who's obviously a much bigger airline, a bigger balance sheet, and we're seeing that happening as we speak. I noticed the people who sat in this chair before me a few moments ago were talking about 26 new routes, many of them in regional Australia, where they're moving in to develop new services for particularly QantasLink. The routes that they've chosen, the regional routes are pretty much all routes that Rex operates to. Some of them are very small routes. Some of them have I noticed they claim that that Qantas is doing this because they intend to make a profit from it. They see pent-up demand in the marketplace, justifying their decision to move into these markets that Rex has been operating into. But the markets that they're operating into are small, and we've had very, very low passenger numbers in them over the last 10 months since COVID came into effect. And if you look at some of the routes they're moving into, I'll take a few here. Albury to Melbourne, which Rex has been operating solely for the last many years. Albury to Melbourne, since April of last year, there have only been 880 passengers on that route. In the month of August last year, there were only 9 passengers in the whole month travelled from Melbourne to Albury on an airline, our airline in this case. If you go to Mount Gambier, where Qantas has also moved to Mount Gambier to Melbourne, since April of last year, there have only been 825 passengers in 10 months, 82.5 passengers a month on average. And, there's Wagga to Melbourne, 920 passengers in a 10-month period. And these are routes that Qantas has moved on to because they claim they're going to make a profit from them, and that there is pent-up demand that justifies their decision to go there. So looking at those numbers, you wouldn't support one airline, let alone 2, with those numbers. They're tiny, they're minuscule numbers. And so the evidence that, you can draw on from those passenger numbers would indicate that Qantas is moving into those routes not to make a profit, because you can't. There's no way in the world you can with those small numbers. They're doing it because they want to swamp us, to push us out of our traditional marketplace and to hurt us financially, so that in turn hurts us in our expansion into the domestic market. And so we do have that risk from being swamped by the larger airlines like Qantas, and we're pleased that the government has decided to give the ACCC additional powers and some additional resources to monitor the behaviour of airlines. And I think initially the government decided to do that for the purposes of protecting the new Virgin from what Virgin experienced many years ago. You may recall, I'm sure Senator Sheldon and yourself would remember the capacity war between Qantas and Virgin many years ago. And the famous speech that Alan Joyce made, where he said, where for every extra plane that Virgin puts on to the route, we'll put 2. And that resulted in a capacity war, and that resulted in prices going down, and that resulted in Qantas having its biggest ever loss in its history, and it was, in my view, the beginning of the end of Virgin. So the government's decision to give the ACCC additional resources and additional powers to monitor the behaviour of airlines, I think, is welcome, and we hope that they will exercise those powers wisely.
Please, Senator McDonald. Mr Sharp, so with Qantas moving into, which is traditionally Rex's patch, let's just put it like that, was that before Rex announced it would go into the domestic interstate market?
No, it was all after, as I recall. Yeah.
That paints the picture, though, because there's been this unwritten sort of agreement, am I right to say, that certain airlines were far more active in certain areas because Qantas didn't move into these small markets on the numbers you've shown us, and I've flown on your flight to Gambier, and when it was pre-COVID, and they were always full flights back then, weren't they, correct? Before
I remember sitting behind you on one of those flights, yeah.
Maybe you getting off before me too, and me missing my connector to Perth, but anyway, that was a laugh.
It is that. Yeah,
So it's after. So it's
it's all after. I mean,
after you announced.
We made announcements in May of last year that we would be moving into we had intentions to move into the domestic market, and so since then we've had these additional routes being announced, and there's no way in the world that you can justify moving into them on the basis that you intend to make profits, because they're tiny routes. They're, traditionally in a good time they've got 20,000 passengers a year, and in the period since COVID's been around, they've had hundreds of passengers in a 10-month period. So there's no economic argument for doing it. It's simply an exercise in intimidation.
And this is not a disrespectful comment. Your fleets, because you keep the price down, they're not the latest planes.
No, they're not. They're the Saab 340.
Saab, yeah.
Saab 340, which you know, they've probably got another 10 to 12 years, maybe a little bit longer, you know, of life left in them, because with all aircraft it becomes an economic decision. You can maintain aircraft forever successfully if you're prepared to pay for it. It just becomes an economic argument. Qantas is operating primarily the Q400, which is a 70-odd seater. I'm sure you've flown in it. And a 70-odd seater doesn't work for smaller regional markets. It doesn't work for, say, a Parkes or a Bathurst. It's just too small a market for an aircraft of that size. So the 34-seat aircraft is an ideal aircraft for these smaller regional routes, the Cooper-Pedy and, you know, all these small regional towns, the Broken Hills, where you don't get a lot of passengers. The 34-seat aircraft's perfect for that. And we do face a problem in the future with replacing these aircraft. What aircraft are we going to replace them with? Because Bombardier, which makes the Dash 8, only makes the 400. Saab doesn't make any aircraft of this type any longer. And there's only one left really in that market space is ATR, which produces a 70 and a 40-odd seater aircraft.
Thank you, Chair. So just to continue on that theme, because, you know, we recall the ANSET TAA, you know, competition, and I remember doing a fly-in, fly-out between Mount Isa and Brisbane and ending up with no aircraft at all, you know, for a 20-hour drive between those two places. And we're very grateful when Virgin came in and we would get on, I think it was midnight, and then you'd share a motel room with a friend to swap over and go in the other direction at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning and back in the other direction. So, and of course Mac Air out of Cloncurry when they were flying the Saab. So, you know, regional airlines are always under the pump to maintain market share, to hold out against competition from the big guys who then disappear off into the distance when, you know, they no longer want to do those routes.
You're right about that. And I noticed Mr. David said that Qantas had only withdrawn from, I think, 2 destinations in their regional network over the years. Well, I don't think that's a correct statement. He forgot Narrabri, he forgot Wellcamp, he forgot Devonport, he even forgot Port Lincoln. Now, and, you know, Port Lincoln, they came back some years later. Devonport, they've just recently come back, and what happens at, well, Narrabri, they've never come back, and in Wellcamp, I don't know what they're going to do there. So that statement is not correct, and it's important for people to understand that. And the small regional routes lead to very fragile economics. And one of the things that is different about regional aviation or regional airlines is that because the distances are often great, the passenger numbers are often small, the economics of making it work are very fragile, and it doesn't take much to upset it. You know, the loss of even a few hundred passengers in a year can throw a route from being viable to being unviable, and as a consequence you can't sustain it. So sometimes more competition can actually result in both airlines losing money and both going away, and that's something that I think people would want to avoid. So when you do play around with regional aviation, it has to be done very carefully. It's not the same when people would say to us, why are you going into the Sydney-Melbourne route? Won't that upset Qantas and Virgin? Well, of course it will upset them because they don't like that competition. But the important point to remember is that Sydney-Melbourne is the second largest route in the world, I think 10.8 million passengers a year. If you Google the largest route in the world, which is London to New York, you'll find that 13, I think it is, airlines operate between London and New York, and the biggest route in the world and the second largest one only has 2 competitors, Virgin and Qantas. And I think, according to Google, when I checked it yesterday, that great authority, in US dollars, Qantas picks up about $850 million thereabouts in revenue out of that Sydney-Melbourne route alone. So, you know, you can afford to have more competition in those bigger routes because they're profitable and they're so large, and Australia really doesn't have as much competition on these big routes as other places around the world would have, and so therefore we don't get the same competitive outcomes.
And is part of that lack of competition because we don't allow overseas airlines to is a technical term for
Cabotage.
Cabotage. We don't allow cabotage.
No, we don't allow cabotage in Australia. We haven't, and I'm sure Senator Sheldon would have a view on that with his previous interests, but we don't, and that protects the Australian airlines from any competition from international airlines. We have a single aviation market between Australia and New Zealand, which I created many years ago in another life, which allows a New Zealand airline to operate in Australia if they wish. Air New Zealand is a major operator in Australia, but it doesn't fly as a domestic airline around Australia, although the opportunity for it to do so exists.
All right, well, I don't want to get distracted down other interesting routes. So coming back to Rex, how will your business manage without JobKeeper? And what is the role for government moving forward for regional airlines, regional routes?
Well, JobKeeper has been important, incredibly important for our business, as it was, you heard from Qantas, and I'm sure, well, in fact, I read a transcript from Jane Hardiger's transcript from the evidence she gave to you the other day, where she made the same point. It has been important. It's enabled us to keep people stood down but paid. It enables us to bring people back into the workforce when things are picking up. We understand it's not going to be extended in its current form, but we hope that there will be some form of assistance to keep airline crews available so that they don't all go off and get other jobs and start other careers and not come back when they're required. And we all live in hope that the airline industry will return to normal fairly quickly. I think some of the forecasts I hear are overly optimistic. I hear 80% we'll be back to 80% domestically by the end of June, July this year. I don't think that's likely to happen. I think some of the forecasts of the past, and Alan's made forecasts that we'd be back to 100%, Qantas will be back to 100% by early 2021, which is about now. They're nowhere near that. Gareth Evans said that Jetstar will be back to 110% by March of this year, which we're now in March, and it's not 110%, we're lucky to be 30%, thereabouts. So I think some of us are being a little over-optimistic. But what I do know is that we do need some assistance to keep staff in place. And the other thing that I think is very important to us, Senator McDonald, is the continuation of RANS in its current form. RANS is, I think, a very effective method of assisting to keep regional communities connected to their major capital cities. Without it, we wouldn't have had these services. I mean, without RANS, Broken Hill wouldn't have had an airline service over the last 10 months, and some other towns wouldn't have had an airline service over the last 10 months because the economics of it doesn't work. So continuation of RANS is, I think, important, and we would like to see that announced by the government in the next little while. And without it, there will be a number of routes which can't be sustained.
Does that support extend to regional airports?
It's an interesting question. Regional airports are now primarily owned by local councils. They were all gifted to those local councils back in the 1980s under the Keating government plan, and it was continued by the Howard government in its early period. And most of those councils were granted the airport which was in Commonwealth ownership, and they were granted a lump of capital to go with it, which is supposed to maintain the airport into the future, but disappeared very quickly in most cases. And there is an argument for governments assisting councils who own those airports in upgrading the airport with a new runway, or a resurfacing of the runway, or replacing the lights with new lights, or some other upgraded capital works program. Where you have to be careful is that some councils, not all, use the capital that's been given to them by the Commonwealth that they then put into a terminal or a runway. They use it to gold plate it. In other words, they build things that aren't necessary. They build things that people don't need, but they like, but the local council likes to think looks good and makes them look good in the local community. And they gold plate it. And as a consequence of that, we have infrastructure which is not necessary. Somebody has to pay for the infrastructure. And so the council then uses the capital that's been given to them, that's been invested in the airport, as a reason to argue that the depreciation of that capital has to be added to the operating costs of the airport, and those operating costs of the airport therefore need to be covered by the regional airlines that operate to it. And there's one airport we fly to where the depreciation is over $2 million a year, and yet theoretically the council that owns that airport hasn't invested a cent in it. It was all given to them by governments, and yet they use the capital that's invested in grants and so forth to increase the depreciation bill, and then they run a policy of saying, well, we're only trying to cover costs. If we can just recover costs, that's all we want, but those costs indeed are inflated, and that adds a considerable amount to the cost of our head taxes, and that has to go into the cost of a ticket, and that reduces the viability of regional airlines. And
are we talking $2 a ticket, or are we talking $20 a ticket?
in some cases, it's certainly not $20 a ticket. In some cases, it's far more than $2 a ticket. If you look at the airport I was referring to, with a $2 million depreciation bill, it has passenger numbers of around 300,000 a year, and so you can divide that into 2 million, and you'll get a figure which is more than $2. So, and again, how you price things in regional aviation is important, because whilst many of the routes we fly to, we don't have a competitor, we're the sole operator. Our real competitor is the motor car, because people make a judgment, will I fly or will I drive? And if we put the price up by a certain amount, people will drive. And I would argue that's a less safe outcome.
To Melbourne, all these short ones.
And it's like when you go to a shop and people price an item at $99.99 rather than $100. Why? Because it sounds cheaper at $99.99, and people say, oh, I'll buy that. But if you say $103, they won't buy it. And so the psychology of how you price your tickets is important. And if you price them right, people will fly. If you price them wrong, they'll drive. And so I would argue that's a less safe outcome for people travelling. And you could argue also that's less of an outcome from an environmental perspective, because you'll create more carbon emissions driving the car from A to B than you will hopping in a plane and flying from A to B.
And it's safe too. I mean, we're seeing that everywhere in North Queensland of, people being on the roads instead of in the air, and it's not creating good outcomes.
No, it doesn't create a good outcome. And I mean, you see it particularly here in Canberra, travelling between Canberra and Sydney, for example, where the ticket price is extremely high, and people are driving now more than they ever have between Canberra and Sydney. For example, I drove to Canberra for this hearing rather than fly, because it's too expensive to fly. And Mr. Murray, Ron Murray, with his coaches, has benefited enormously from it. His passenger numbers between Canberra and Sydney have boomed. So, when you put the price up, people will exercise their right to choose which way they want to go, drive or fly.
Now, the Chair's...
Or you can use the train, yes.
Chair's been very patient with me. I just have one more question, Mr. Sharp, and that's around... I'd like to come back, as a committee, I think we need to come back and include a recommendation around regional airports and funding. So if I could just, as they say in modern day speak, put a pin in that, come back to it. But I finally want to just talk to you about slots at Sydney Airport. I think that's an important part for allowing airlines to have access, and I just want to understand what your situation is for access to landing times.
Well, thank you. Slots at Sydney Airport are critical for any airline operation in Australia, because Sydney Airport's the largest commercial airport in the country, and access to it is vital if you want to be a participant in the Australian airline industry. I created, again in another life, I created the slots back in 1996, and the philosophy we used for the slots was that, firstly, that the slots would create certainty, so that airlines could build a schedule and then sell tickets off that schedule. The second element to it was that the slots weren't a competitive barrier, that they didn't bar new entrants from coming into Sydney Airport. The third was that nobody owned the slots. The airline didn't own the slots, the airport didn't own the slots, the city or the town didn't own the slots. The Commonwealth owned the slots, and the Commonwealth deployed those slots to the national benefit. And the fourth element to it was if you didn't use a slot, you lost it. And those four principles have guided the way the slot system has operated over the years, and I think it's fair to say it's operated fairly successfully, and it's just been the subject of a review by Peter Harris, former chair of the Productivity Commission, who was involved in the establishment of the slots at Sydney Airport. So with COVID, the Minister chose to grandfather all slots. So in other words, if you had a slot before COVID, you kept it in the post-COVID period. And the result of that is that all the peak period slots, which is now the bulk of the day at Sydney Airport, are effectively owned by Qantas or Virgin or other international airline operators. And so we have, when trying to access Sydney Airport for our new domestic operation, we've been confronted with, when we put our first application in for slots, we were given 0 slots. Why? Because all the slots were allocated to airlines that had been operating pre-COVID. And one of the strange things about it is that slots that were once allocated to Tiger were still continued to be allocated to Tiger's owner, which is Virgin Airlines, even though Tiger no longer exists. There's no planes, no passengers, no pilots, no nothing. And so we found that rather strange, that those slots would be still held, if you like, as Tiger slots, but with Virgin, the owner of Tiger. And clearly, if you go to the airport today, there's plenty of room. There's very few flights being operated, very few people there. So we, again, had to wait until just a couple of weeks ago for all the airlines to be given the opportunity to hand in their slots, and then we were given slots from those airlines that handed in slots. So we have enough slots for Sydney operations during the next 6-month period, which starts around the 24th of March and goes through to the 24th of October. But we don't know what slots we'll have allocated to us in the period from the 24th of October, the 6-month period from 24th of October to 24th of March next year. So we have no certainty as to whether we can operate into Sydney Airport because we have no certainty about access to slots. And one of the things that we hope will come out of Peter Harris's review of the slot system is that there will be space made available for new entrants. And it's not just Rex. I mean, we're not the only people who you would expect to want to start services into Sydney Airport in the future. You would expect others, Alliance and Link and various other operators may at some point in the future try and start a service to Sydney Airport. But unless a pool of slots is made available for new entrants, like a Rex or somebody else in the future, that can't happen. And so that, if we don't see those changes made, those slots allocated for new entrants, effectively you will block competition in the Australian domestic airline industry, and the consumers will be the worse off for that. It will lead to higher prices, less choice, and not as good services.
When do you expect that report, that slots report, to become available?
You're going to get as much time.
Well, we understand the slots, the review of the slots by Peter Harris has been presented to the department, and we have no visibility as to what it is. That hasn't been published, and we don't know what the government's changes or view of the report is. We await that outcome, but we do hope that in the case of the slots, that there's a number of slots allocated. I mean, to new entrants. I mean, you could put all the slots that were once used by Tiger into a new entrants pool. You could probably take 10% of all the slots off the top from everybody else and put them into a new entrants pool, because there's no way in the world for the next year or so that either Qantas or Virgin will be back to 100% of what they used to be pre-COVID. I mean, Virgin's not going to be back to 100% because here they are, and now today with about half the aircraft they had pre-COVID. So it's physically impossible for them to use all of the slots that they had pre-COVID because they don't have the planes to fill them. And Qantas, of course, has got a large portion of their aircraft parked in the desert, and they won't be able to physically use those slots either. So it's not an unreasonable thing to say, let's give 10% of all the slots and put them in a pool. Let's take the Tiger slots and put them in a pool and encourage new entrants to come into the market.
All right, thank you, Chair. I'd be very keen that this committee asks to see that report be published as soon as possible and that we provide a recommendation around that, because I think that traffic through Sydney it's a cornerstone of the aviation market. So, thank you, Chair.
And just, I'll go to Senator Sheldon now.
Thank you, Mr. Sharp, for joining us. And as I think we certainly all share in this room, the importance of regional aviation has been critical to the continuing connection of the entire community across the region, but also for our tourism industry and our agricultural industry, and of course all the need to make sure that we're connected with each other across this vast continent. And Rex plays an important role in that business. There was some questions on notice I think you received as well regarding...
Look, I apologise, I don't seem to have received them beforehand, but if you'd like to either ask them now or give them to me and we'll get you some answers.
I might put them on notice. Things are quite detailed, so that it'll save you the fumbling around for the answers. Because the other, you mentioned in your evidence that Qantas moving into markets that on the surface, for any reasonable person would say it's not a market that's likely to be profitable. It's a challenging market in some of those destinations that you, using my language, a challenging market for Rex as it is because of passenger numbers. And having a second airline there doesn't seem to make economic sense. Do you feel that Qantas is sort of has a war chest to actually, have this, to move into those markets which are not on its surface profitable?
Senator Sheldon, I think you are correct in making that or speculating about that. It's quite clear Qantas has made a decision to attack Rex in its traditional regional market. Nobody in their right mind, when you're losing, as they just announced last week, experiencing a record loss, 1.47 billion statutory loss, nobody in their right mind would expand their business into further loss-making services without another reason for doing it. You're not going to make money on Mount Gambier to Melbourne with only a few hundred passengers in a 10-month period. You're not going to make money travelling from Melbourne to Albury with a few 800 passengers in a 10-month period, 9 passengers in a whole month on that route. So there's no possibility of making money on those sectors. The only thing that's going to happen is they'll lose money. So why would anybody in their right mind want to go and lose money? Well, there has to be another reason. Qantas is not run by stupid people, they're run by very smart people. And those people have, in our view, made a conscious decision to attack us, to try and knock us out of the market and find themselves in a position of being then a monopoly operator in those markets. And also the purpose behind it is to damage our ability to compete vigorously in the domestic market. If our regional base is undermined and our income is damaged from the regional base being attacked by Qantas, then our ability to withstand competition in the domestic market is reduced. So it's quite a clear decision in our view that that's what they're up to. And Qantas is it's obviously the biggest airline in Australia. It's been around 100 years. It's got a long history. It's got a very big reputation in terms of brand image and being a part of the Australian culture. They claim that their motto is the spirit of Australia, and I would ask you, Senator Sheldon, whether you think the spirit of Australia is going about beating up the little guy in the marketplace. Is that the spirit of Australia?
I might also add, I noted you haven't made any workers redundant in your description, and yet Qantas has made 2,500 workers not redundant, but outsourced those jobs. And I'm very mindful that Qantas is taking a very different approach to, as you say, the small guy in this case. And those cases I'm mentioning is also both a business sense but also a personal sense for their own staff.
Yeah, I mean, we value our staff. I mean, we're a smaller company, we have less staff, more personal relations with our staff. Many of our staff have been with us for 30, 40 years. I had breakfast yesterday morning with one of our pilots who's been with us nearly 40 years. So it's a much more personal relationship we have with the people and that work with us, and we've done our best to keep them from being made redundant, and in return they've been magnificent in their support of the company along the way. But to do it, we're not like other airlines. I mean, we don't pay big salaries, for example. Our top executives are paid in the $200,000 bracket, not, obviously in other airlines they get paid a whole lot more. In our first few years, for the first 10 years, we didn't pay a dividend to the shareholders in order to try and build the financial strength of the company up. And the chairman, for example, who can't be here today, despite the fact that he'd like to be here today, he's trapped overseas, the chairman doesn't take a salary, and for 10 years he didn't get a dividend. And so we have a very different approach to the way we run our business. It's about building for the long term, and rather than short-term gains, and I think that's the reason we've been able to survive, where others have not been able to survive. It's by taking less reward for longer-term gain, and other businesses have done this as well. I mean, we took those on the board and the executive all took a 20% pay cut during the course of the year in response to COVID, in order to try and help contribute to the stronger financial position of the company.
So, but what would you estimate as Rex's market share on regional services pre-COVID?
Well, of the regional airlines that operate in Australia, we have about 70% of the tails, the aircraft that operate, and
Passenger numbers?
in terms of passenger numbers, around 1.3 to 1.4 million passengers a year. But in the regional airline business, we're the biggest operator in terms of aircraft, about 70% of all the aircraft that operate in what you call the traditional regional market.
And the percentage of passengers that are moved around the regional market, I'm clear about the number of planes you have as a percentage of 70%, as you've mentioned. What would be the numbers of passengers that you would have in that regional market that would be flying on your planes?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer precisely, and it depends on how you define regional. The department will often define regional as being flights to regional areas. Many of those flights are fly-in, fly-out flights, and they're then defined as regional passengers. And you could argue that's a correct description of regional traffic. We would see that as not necessarily part of what we would call the traditional regional market. The traditional regional market is an RPT market that's not based around charters, that's not a fly-in, fly-out operation, that is just a normal service to a country town or a regional city with a regular schedule, and anybody can hop on once they buy their ticket. So some of these numbers distort the shape of the market simply because they include what I would consider, some would consider, not traditional regional airline passengers.
If you were to use your interpretation, there's the charter flights and as part of the swim of regional, and then there's non-charter flights. What would be in those two circumstances? Would you?
Well, I
say as a percentage of
I
the
can't
market?
give you a precise answer to that. It would be
A rough estimate.
It would be greater than 50%. It would be closer to the number of tails that we have. It would be sort of between 50 and 70% of the what I'd call the traditional regional airline market.
I appreciate this is only a rough estimate. In looking at if you were to include the charters, what would you estimate?
Well, the charters, can bring several million passengers into, remote parts of Australia for mining purposes, and particularly in West Australia and Queensland, that's the case, and to a lesser extent South Australia, and to an even lesser extent the Northern Territory. But I can't give you those figures, Senator Sheldon. I'm sorry, don't have them in the back of my head.
If I could just tell me if I'm too high or too low, and I appreciate you not be able to give us exact figures, but if there's 7 million passengers that are doing those charter flights, if I understood what you said, and there's over 1 million passengers that you have on the operation. If I was to add that 7 million, which I understand is largely other airlines other than Rex doing that charter work, if you was to include actual passengers in your category, which is 50% of the market, that brings about 8 million. So, 1/8 would be a rough estimate of that other figure if you were to say what regional airlines are, including charters.
Yeah.
Yeah,
look,
rough estimates, not a science.
Any estimate I make would be rough. I mean, one of the traps that airline people fall into, is they want to talk about share of the market. People get excited about that. We don't get excited about that. What we focus on is making our airline profitable so it's sustainable and viable, so it can continue to operate, provide a service, give people a career, give the shareholders a dividend. And so it's one of the fallacies of modern airline management where they talk about market share. To me, it's irrelevant. What matters is, are you operating sustainably, making a profit? And that's the thing that matters. And, Virgin had 37% of the domestic market, and yet it never made a profit. In the last 10 years, it never made a profit. Qantas can have 65% of the domestic market. I think currently it's got 70% of the domestic market, but it loses money. What's the more important thing, the market share or the profit? And so for me, it's not a figure that we focus on.
No, thanks. So I'm just sort of roughly the figure on the. And I appreciate your explanation there. But just so in my head, I just get some size questions. There's obviously more additional questions to be asked other than just size and market share. You've made that point very clear. So if I'm roughly saying it's if you're using the charters, it's you're 1/8 the size. Is that too high or too low?
Probably a bit low. Another way to look at it would be the number of RPT services that go to regional Australia, each week or each year. That would be another way of looking at it, and I couldn't give you those percentages either. It's as I say, it's not a figure that we see as particularly important. The importance is to run your business in a proper manner that you can make a profit and keep it operating into the future.
I just want just a query about are you familiar with a company called AUS Ground Handling?
AUS Ground Handling? Yes. What's the relevance of that?
Well, I'm just wanting to know that in January they were advertising for check-in agents in Brisbane. I'm just wondering whether you're advertising for jobs through this company, or do you have a partner or contract with them?
We've got a number of companies that we have been talking to in regard to our expansion of the network into the domestic market, and I can't give you an answer as to whether that's one of those companies. You probably know the answer. That's the reason why you've asked the question.
Yeah, I was going to the point of that they outsourced. Is it an outsourced company that works for Rex?
I can't answer that question. We do have a number of companies who provide outsourced services to RREX in different destinations. I mean, we have 60 destinations around the country. Not all of them are manned by RREX personnel. Our habit, and I'm sure you would agree with this, our habit is to try and do everything in-house as best we can. So, for example, years ago, we used to have outsourced baggage handling, but we decided to bring it in-house because we felt we could do it better. We used to have outsourced catering. We brought it in-house because we feel we can do it better in-house. And even things like pilot training, we do that in-house. We've established we bought one in Ballarat and we've built another one in Wagga, two very large pilot training facilities, and we do that because we feel we can do that better in-house. So our culture is to do things in-house, but because of the length and breadth of the places that we operate to all over Australia, I mean, we operate in every state with the exception of the Northern Territory, which is technically not a state. We operate in small places where you don't even have, in some cases, work for a full-time employee. We need to go to outsourced personnel under a contract to provide that service. So it's a part of any airline's operation, but it is our culture to try and do everything in-house. And you'll note that we don't, similarly with consultants, we prefer not to employ consultants, and we believe that if you have to employ a consultant, you've got the wrong management team. So that's our culture, is to have those services operating from within our business rather than from outside.
I think we know some good transport companies road transport companies that have had that same view for a very long time.
A long time, and you know them well.
I'll put those questions on notice just about the Australian ground handling, because you said you weren't sure, so I'll put those on notice. Just want to turn to another matter. You raised the importance of the financial performance of the company, obviously, and very much a focus of the company. And also that certainly the only company in Australia, and I think you hazard to guess that it was worldwide, that has had such strong financial performance. Has that been vital to the decision to extend to the capital city market?
Well, we wouldn't be in a position to do it if we hadn't been profitable, had a track record of delivering profits. We couldn't have even raised the capital to expand into the domestic market if we hadn't had that track record of being able to manage our affairs in such a way that we could produce a profit at the end of the year. And you're quite right, we are unusual. I mean, we do things differently in our business to traditional airline operators, and we tend to try and run it as a business. The airline industry, as you well know, it has a lot of passion behind it, and the people involved in it are very passionate about the industry. And that passion is great in some ways, but it can be a problem in other ways, and it can lead you to make bad business decisions. We try to run our business on sound business decisions. We believe that has enabled us to survive and to prosper during the period since RREX was formed in 2001. And so we could not have expanded without a track record of profitability.
So imagine if RREX was in, from your evidence, if RREX was in financial trouble, then obviously it'd be harder to assess the capital city program that you need for your expansion. So it would be less, I mean, obviously that would be less, from your answer, it means it would be less likely to invest in that sort of approach.
Yeah. I think it's a fair assumption, Senator Sheldon, that that is the case. And you've got to put yourself in the boots of an investor. Would you invest with somebody who hadn't had a track record of profitability? Would you invest with them? Probably not, unless you're a strange sort of person. You would invest with somebody who had
unless you're Uber.
Yes, well,
or Amazon.
There are lots of people who actually do invest in businesses that don't seem to produce profits. I mean, Tesla could be another example if you wanted to go there. But in our game, in our business, it's a difficult business to get investment into because it's seen as too cyclical. and subject to shocks and setbacks. And so if you can demonstrate to investors, potential investors, that you can survive all those setbacks, that you've positioned yourself in a way that you can operate through the good times and the bad times successfully, then you'll attract an investor. And that's what we've been able to do in the form of the convertible note that we've now got.
Now you mentioned you've got separate funding for the expansion, but would it be true to say that the expansion is a direct product of your strong financial performance last year? And you've said that, and does that include, and the strong financial performance of course included $54 million untied grants from the government?
No, so you're putting words in my mouth there, because I didn't say it was based on our strong financial performance last year, which are the words you've added.
I'm very happy for you to clarify.
Yeah, good. So we've had a long track record of profitability. I mean, since the first year of its operation, Rex has been profitable. And so I know where you're coming to with this, but you need to understand that the investor would not have invested in us if our profit was only in the last 12 months. It's over a lengthy period of time, continuously so. And the other factor that I think impressed the investors was that we were debt-free, and that gave us if you like, a degree of comfort for investors to know that we weren't subject to those monthly interest payments or future capital repayments that might loom up in 6 months' time, 12 months' time, however long, whenever the loan that you've taken out expires. And the other thing, of course, that attracted investors is the fact that we own all of our fleet, the 60 Saab aircraft, or 61 of them, Saab aircraft, and we own our buildings, warehouses, offices. We own the 2 pilot training academies and all the aircraft in them and the accommodation that goes with it, all the equipment, everything we own, so we don't have to pay rents or leases to other parties every month as other airlines do. So it's a combination of those things, but it's certainly not because of the profits we made last year, just.
Sharp, I recognise that you've made a very compelling argument about anyone investing in a company. They would not just look at the previous year, they'd look at a number of years. And anyone in their right mind would do that in any business. But if you weren't profitable this year and you were down $54 million, do you think they would still be investing in this expansion?
I think so, because I think they would have, simply because it was expected that we would have lost money. And I know where you're driving this to, but most people would have expected all airlines to operate at a loss during this COVID period. And private equity firms are, like most other people, have similar expectations. But I think the private equity firm and others whom we approached were interested in our performance in past years as a guide to whether we were a good firm to invest in. It's also worth noting that the decision to invest was made well before our current results were announced. I mean, we announced our results just about a week or so ago, not even that. And the decision to invest with us was made in the first or second half of last year, the early part of second half of last year, so well before those results were even known. So I know you're trying to draw a connection to the RAFA funding and everything else, but it all was done, the decisions were all made before the effect of that, before the financial outcomes that we've just announced recently were known.
So you would have got. So what you're putting to me, and that is that and there's appropriate questions to ask. That the $54 million, if that hadn't have been granted this by the government, untied grants, that you would have still expanded into those markets, the Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane market.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that. The thing to also say is that if there hadn't been the RAFA program, there wouldn't be a single regional airline in the country. I mean, you can't. I mean, we ran the risk of failing without Commonwealth assistance, as did every other regional airline in the country. And as I mentioned before, Rex is different to most of the regional airlines in Australia because we're a public listed company and most of those are family businesses. I mean, Link, here, based here in Canberra, Sharp Aviation, no relationship, based in Melbourne and or Victoria and Tasmania, family businesses. And if you go around the other small operators, you'll find that most of them are family businesses where basically their family home is the balance sheet. So there wouldn't be any of these airlines operating to regional communities without that funding. But I know where you're trying to take it, and I'm happy to answer these questions, but I was hoping that you might have some questions about the topic of this inquiry, which is about the future of aviation. And I was hoping you might ask me.
This does get to, I do, and there's been some exceptionally good questions asked by Senator McDonald covering a lot of the space I wanted to ask you questions about, so I don't want to traverse matters you've already dealt with. In the case of, and this is, I'm getting to the point on this line of questioning, and that is that for the $54 million untied grants that were granted to the company, and you have a percentage of the market of both planes but also passenger numbers, and segmentising it in two different ways that you described aptly before. I think that's a fair say that there is very different segments of the market of regional work and how you can describe it. But in all those circumstances, for example, Virgin is a major player in both those significant player in both those segments, but they received no untied grants. What do you see as the logic of them not receiving untied grants?
Well, you'd have
being
to ask,
excluded.
You'd have to ask that question of the government. I'm not the government, and their reasons for doing so would be best known by them. But I would say to you that Virgin was, you wouldn't call, and Virgin never called itself a regional airline, and it operated to regional areas. It had relatively speaking, a very small network of destinations around Australia, and we only competed with Virgin in places like Albury, Mildura, and I'm trying to think where else we might have competed with them, but not many other places. And so you would never describe Virgin as a regional airline, and it would describe itself as a regional airline, nor would you describe Qantas as a regional airline, although it does operate a regional airline called QantasLink, which goes to many destinations around Australia. I mean, QantasLink is probably a more credible airline to call a regional airline than Virgin's airline operations that worked in or flew into regional areas. So I know that doesn't answer your question quite to the same degree that you would like, but I can't answer for the government. But what I can say is that whatever funding was made available to Rex was made available to every other regional airline in the country, and that we complied with all of the terms and conditions that were part of those grants. And we've been audited to ensure that we have done that, and we will continue to be audited. There'll be pretty much no further funding in that program now anyway, but we will be audited to ensure that all the terms and conditions that were stipulated for the receipt of those funds have been met by us, and I'm sure that would apply to all the other regional airlines. So it's an interesting point to make. I said to you that we have about 70% of the tails of aircraft that operate in what we would call the traditional regional airline market. We only receive 55% of the funding under RAFA. So, if you wanted to take a diametrically different view to the one that you're trying to take, you could argue that we were underfunded, but we're not arguing that. We're just saying we're very appreciative of what we got. We're saying that, without that help, there wouldn't be a regional airline in operation today. And my guess, if I was to guess what the government was doing, was they were trying to maintain those core essential air services, and it wasn't really about funding Rex or Link or Sharp Aviation or Wings or Air North or any other regional airline that you want to think about. It was about funding regional communities so that those regional communities could remain connected to their major capital city where they have services, be they, you know, the freight of pathology tests and, you know, magistrates and police and nurses and doctors and goodness knows who else that travel on those regional services. My guess is that the government wanted to keep those communities connected, and regional airlines were the only way they could see that being done, and hence the support for regional communities was given via the regional airlines. But it was ultimately all about regional communities, not about Rex or any of the other ones. It was just we happened to be the ones who provided that service and provided those communities with the connections that they needed. And that's what I would guess is the rationale for the government. But I can't speak for the government. You're probably in a better position than most to do that.
Mr. Sharp, I'm not. I'll reel back just briefly to my opening comments, and that is that the regional network is critically important to connectivity in the regions and across the country. It's economically important. It's community importance, and those things are very big drivers in, I'm sure, everybody in this room's minds. The point I'm drawing to, and that is that there are other regional operators such as Qantas and Virgin who operate in that space that weren't given the same opportunity. I'm not begrudging opportunities. I'm saying the same opportunities weren't extended to those companies as well. That's the point I'm making.
Good. Well, if I can put words in your mouth now. If I could suggest to you that
Have a go.
Okay, we've both been having a go. I'd like to, we're coming to the end of this session.
I've just got one other question. I've just got one.
Minutes ago, but anyway.
Okay,
I've just got one more
if you've got one
question
more question, ask it,
this,
and I'll see if it's about the future or it's about something to do with the past, and I'll try and toss in something about the future. Okay.
Well, you're welcome to put words in my mouth, but if you didn't want to take that opportunity up, but I'll have a go at it in a moment. You know, there's been a lot said about obviously Australian Airlines, and we've seen, you know, Tiger, Ansett, Australian, Compass, they're all confident that we're coming into the market to have three major airlines. They had highly experienced, well-considered, a number of investment companies coming into their operations to say that this is a goer. And you've described me that the investment company that's investing in this expansion has the same view. Is there room for three operators? Because there's been a history of that not working.
Yeah, it's a good question. People ask us that question regularly, and they draw on history to base the question on. And you're quite right in the way you've structured your question about the history of other airlines trying to enter the market in what has basically been a duopoly for as long as we can remember. What I would say is that, yes, we can support more operators in some of our routes around Australia. Rex has started on what's called the Golden Triangle, which I know you know all about. Sydney-Melbourne, Sydney-Brisbane, Brisbane-Melbourne. That's our sort of core start. And in those routes, there are, as I mentioned earlier, there's 10.8 million passengers a year pre-COVID between Sydney and Melbourne, second biggest route in the world. Some would argue the most profitable airline route in the world. It's an arguable point, but many would argue it. And we would suggest that in those size markets, there are usually multiple operators, not just two, but in the case of, I gave New York to London, and when I Googled it yesterday to see how many airlines operate between London and New York, there came up 13 airlines. There may be more. And certainly in other parts of the world with even smaller routes than Sydney to Melbourne, you get multiple airlines operating, 5 and 6 airlines operating on smaller routes. So theoretically, we should be able to sustain 3 operators on that route. And if you go to some of the other destinations around Australia, we've actually got some very big routes. I mean, let me see, Adelaide to Melbourne's 3.1 million. Again, you could sustain more than 2 operators on that route. It's big enough to cope if you use international examples as a guide. Gold Coast to Sydney, 3.1 million. Again, you could sustain more than 2 operators on that route if you look at other international operations. If you go to Melbourne to the Gold Coast, 2.4 million. Again, it's a route big enough to sustain more than 2 operators. And so I think that, to answer your question, yes, there is room in the market. One has to be very careful and disciplined about the way you go about it. The other thing that gives us comfort is that we know we have a very low cost base, and you know, some of the things I've talked about earlier give you an idea as to where that low cost base come from. I mean, our senior executives, you know, paid in the 200,000 bracket, which is very different to other airline operations. We don't pay rent, we don't pay lease payments to third parties for our capital equipment, and that saves us a lot of money. And our culture is a family business. I mean, we were started by Max Hazelden and his family and Don Kendall and his family, still both involved with us, pleasingly enough. Max was with us this week, and Don Kendall's granddaughter still works with Rex. So we still have that connection, and we operate like a family business. And family businesses, as you no doubt know too well, follow the dollars very carefully. We're very cost conscious, and the fact that I'm here by myself today, I'm not part of a larger entourage of people, would, as opposed to the people here before, reflects the fact that we try and do things at the lowest possible cost. And it's right through our culture. And our business, we try and do 1,000 things well. And we focus on even the most minute cost to try and make a saving. So we've got a low cost base. That gives us comfort. And we think these markets that we have in Australia, some, not all, are big enough to sustain more than 2 operators. And the net benefit of that, Senator Sheldon, is I think that consumers will enjoy more competitive prices and better services, more frequent services.
Just a bit of assistance in, again, this question about the future and the competition on those routes and potentially other routes. And you've outlined the company's approach to going to the market and what you're building your confidence on. I hear that loud and clear. Of those other companies that failed on that market, there's a large number of them, is there anything in addition to, you're making it very clear the differences between you and others, and I gather that extends to those other companies that have collapsed. That's a big difference from you to others. That's I gather you're putting to me. Is there any other differences that you would say, or maybe even reversing it? Are there any other reasons why those companies were unsuccessful?
Well, some of them were starting from scratch. They had to build an infrastructure in order to offer a service. And we already have an infrastructure. We have all the departments that you need to operate an airline successfully. They already exist. And so for us, it's a matter of adding more resources to existing infrastructure to accommodate an expansion into the domestic market. And the other good news about what we're doing is we're offering jobs to people in the industry. I mean, our expectation is to employ another 400 people during the course of this year, which is good news for people who have lost their jobs. We've employed, contrary to the pilots union, all of our people that we've employed are, all here locally Australian, based Australian people who have lost their jobs with Qantas or Virgin in recent times, been made redundant. Our pilots, for example, the 2 pilots who flew our first flight out of Melbourne to Sydney on Monday morning, They were recently made redundant by Virgin. They actually started their careers in Hazelton, which
I
is...
should say my apologies, I couldn't make it on Monday, so I was actually going to attend too.
Well, you missed out on the cake. You would have enjoyed it.
I'm gluten-free, so
Yeah,
maybe
well,
I didn't.
we had a good gathering, but we'll save you a bit of the cake. But you'll find that all of those people that we're employing are pretty much all, a couple of exceptions, pretty much all ex-Qantas, ex-Virgin, and giving them a career back in something that they're very passionate about and they're very good at. Because, you know, while some people have, in the media and the union has tried to portray it, we're actually wanting to employ international pilots, absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. It'd have to be completely stupid to do it because we've got so many good people here, you know, well-qualified, experienced people who are Australian, living here in Australia, who are available immediately to start. And so that's what we're doing, and we're very pleased to be able to do that, to offer those people a fresh opportunity.
Now, on rounding up, Senator McDonald, you do have one last one.
This will be very brief, and I'm sure you'll answer it very briefly for me, Mr Sharp, to assist me with the Chair's good graces. The suggestion continues to be made that the RAFA grants are untied, and I would just ask you to clarify the audit process or the compliance process, just so that we can remove this inference that it is untied funding.
Well, I notice certain people have said, use the term "no strings attached" to the RAFA grants, and that's not correct. It's the funds have been made for specific purposes, and each airline had to put in to the department where the funds were required and where they would be spent, and we had to give estimates as to what the cost of that would be. And I can only speak for Rex, but I'm sure it's the same for the other regional airline operators. We put in our estimates of what had to be funded and the cost of that particular item, and the department came back and didn't fund all of them, and didn't fund all of them to the extent that we had suggested. They then gave us funds, not all in one go, but over a period of months, and then we get audited on the allocation of those funds. They use, I'll stand corrected on this, I think they use PwC as their auditor, and they do what you'd expect an auditor to do. They do a forensic exercise in looking as to, we asked for money here, we were allocated money for that. Where did we spend that money, and did we spend it as it was allocated for? And if it wasn't spent as it was allocated, we would have to give the money back. Now, that hasn't happened because we've done our very best to comply, and I'm sure, again, without qualified to speak on behalf of other regional airlines, I'm sure they've done the same thing because the terms and conditions are very strict. It's this amount of money for this particular thing to be paid for now or in a month's time or whenever it is, and that's the way the department ran it, and it has a fair bit of compliance work involved in it, but it is, from our perspective, obviously very welcome.
And again, this particular thing was maintaining services to regional communities, because probably both of the other senators received the same calls that I did, which is, how do we get a doctor to that hospital? How do we get the chemo treatments to that town? How do we get urgent supplies, without airlines?
Well, that's right. I mean, we have this rule of thumb, and it varies from town to town, but it's a good rule of thumb to use, is that about a third of our passengers in normal times are travelling for medical purposes. They're either doctors going to the regional community as specialists to provide a specialty service, or surgeons, or they're people travelling from the regional community to the capital city to see a specialist there, or to attend hospital, or to have some form of examination. And so that's about a third of our market. The other third of our market is what we would call government travel, people like magistrates, because a lot of these towns don't have a permanent magistrate. The magistrate flies in, and they even, police officers and even district nurses, would you believe, fly with us because there's not work for a district nurse full-time in a particular town, so they come up once a week and spend a couple of days and then go back. It's a market that's about a third government, and then the other third is sort of business and leisure, and mainly small business in our case because of the nature of being in the regional areas.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Don, Mr Sharp, thank you very much for your extra time. We know where to find you should we have to follow anything else up.
Thank you
so
very much.
Travel safe. And we'll now